So again, a big welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you're at. My name is Chris Hillbrenner. I'm the Division Chief for Analysis and Learning within RFS. About a year ago, as we started to unpack the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the questions that kept coming up was about the persistence of COVID impacts on household well-being. We were starting to see impacts on poverty. We were starting to hear about the potential impacts on malnutrition. And a key question was, is this a bump in the road that we'll get past the pandemic and we'll sort of return to the trends that we saw before COVID-19? Or are the impacts we're starting to see something that is going to persist? And so to try to get some answers to this question, we've been partnering with the Pardee Center and with NORC over the last year to do a series of analyses looking at how COVID is likely to impact households and how those impacts are likely to play out between now and 2040. And while this has been primarily a collaboration with NORC and the Pardee Center, we've been lucky enough to have input from a wide range of other stakeholders, both within USAID and from partner agencies that I think have really strengthened the analysis. And so today, while many questions about the impact of COVID-19 persist, I think we do have some answers about how we think these impacts are going to persist over the coming decades. And I think that these have important implications for the work that we do here at USAID. So I'm really pleased to have our colleagues from the Pardee Center here to walk us through the approach that they took and some of the key findings from this analysis, and then to have what I expect to be a really interesting discussion with all of you about these findings and what they might mean for all of our efforts around the world. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Willem Verhagen from the Pardee Center to take us through the presentation. Over to you, Willem.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to present to you today. So my name is Willem Verhagen and I work at the Pardee Center. Today, joining us on the call as well are Jonathan Moyer, who's the director of our center, David Bull, who's a co-author on the paper, as well as, I believe, I at least saw two students who also heavily contributed to the work that we will be presenting to you today, which are Andres and Audrey. During the presentation, you have the opportunity to basically ask questions through the chat, and both my colleagues Jonathan and David will be trying to answer as many of the questions as you have. So, as Chris was saying, for the last year, we've been working on trying to answer basically two questions. What does the future of food security look like out to 2040? And how will COVID-19 be affecting that future? Now, to start that off and to kind of set the stage, what we're seeing, of course, today is that initially the COVID-19 pandemic started as a global pandemic that was affecting human health and human lives. But very quickly, and given the extent we saw impacts on economic growth, and the most recent projections also show some recovery, but especially kind of a slowdown of recovery in lower middle income countries. As a consequence, for the first time in basically 2 decades, global extreme poverty rose in 2020 by an estimated 80 to 150 million people. So really initially we were very much interested in kind of trying to understand what are the direct impacts of COVID-19. What we've seen over the course of the last year is also more and more reports that come out that looked at, well, what will actually be the persistence of those effects on human well-being and on food security. And across those different reports, basically there was a real kind of warning that there might be some real long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on human well-being that persists far beyond 2020. And that's basically the premises of how we try to answer those questions today in terms of what will COVID-19 mean for food security in 2040. Now, the presentation today, as well as the report, will basically try to answer that question in 3 main ways. First and foremost, and what we will primarily focus on today is to look at outcome indicators and to quantify how much COVID-19 will be affecting extreme poverty, undernourishment, and child stunting in 2040. Now, it's one thing to kind of get at these numbers, but it's another thing to kind of understand and contextualize those numbers. So a second part of the presentation, as well as the report, goes into how COVID-19 is actually affecting food security. What are the main impacts and why is actually extreme poverty and undernourishment changing by 2040? And to kind of contextualize also these numbers and to look at some of the relevance of the long-term impacts, we also try to compare some of the COVID-19 impacts on human well-being by 2040 to effects of conflicts and to effects of climate change. So before we really start looking at the results, it's helpful to give a little bit of an introduction into the underlying methodology. And I'm going to try to keep this relatively short, but I think it's helpful to kind of understand the analysis that we will be presenting today. So at the Pardee Center, we work with the International Futures Model, or we often refer to as the IFS model. And the IFS model is a long-term forecasting tool that focuses on economic and human development across 186 countries. It can provide projections for instance, 10 years out to 2030 or 2040, as we do in this analysis, but it can go all the way out to 2100. Now, the International Futures Model itself isn't purely a food security model. It is kind of stylistically represented on this slide, and it has, for instance, a representation of the agricultural system, a representation of the economic system, as well as a representation of the demographic system that together really strongly shape kind of the future of food security. But more broadly, it also interacts with, for instance, a representation of climate change, representation of infrastructure, and for instance, access to water and sanitation, as well as impacts of changes in education and in the health system. So it's really an integrated model that at the one hand focuses on trying to represent these individual submodules, but also really focuses on representing the interactions between these different elements that together shape economic and human development over time. Now, the International Futures Model, and some of my colleagues might be able to share that in the chat as well, it's fully open source. So if anyone that's kind of interested can open the model up online. You can download the model, you can run some analysis, look at the data, and also all the underlying documentation for the model itself is fully open source. So everyone that kind of wants to learn more about the model is more than welcome to go to any of these web pages. Now, the way that we often use the International Futures Model in thinking about long-term trends and economic and human development over time is through the building of scenarios. And scenarios are basically alternative representations of how the world might develop over time. And specifically, of course, today we are interested in scenarios that focus on potential impacts of COVID-19. Now, a lot of our work focuses on developing these scenarios. But one of the things that Chris already mentioned that I think is quite interesting and important for this analysis is that we really had like expert consultations in which we talked to people from the World Bank, IFPRI, USAID, and other groups. And basically, how is COVID-19 affecting the world today? What are the main long-term impacts and what data is available to estimate those impacts? But we also really discussed kind of what are the main uncertainties related to these scenarios. And from these consultation sessions, we came up with a 3-scenario and kind of 4-tier impact framework. So we developed 3 scenarios. First and foremost, a no COVID scenario. That's basically our counterfactual scenario that we use to compare the effects of COVID-19 against. And then two COVID-19 scenarios, a current path scenario that uses existing data to best describe kind of the known impacts of COVID-19 today and project kind of the effects of that on development out to 2040, and an unequal path scenario. And that unequal path scenario gets at one of the kind of core uncertainties that was raised during those expert sessions. And that is kind of what if the COVID-19 pandemic has, even more than we understand today, disproportionate effects on low and middle income countries, both in terms of the impacts today, as well as on their recovery pattern. So those are the 3 scenarios that we will be looking at today. And the way that we represent COVID-19 in the International Futures Model is through 4 impacts. The most important impact is on a reduction in GDP growth in 2020 and a partial recovery following in 2021 and 2022. Now, that itself is a really important impact because the economic model is really strongly connected to all the other economic and human development models in the International Futures Model. So change in economic growth basically has ripple through effects across all sorts of different systems. In addition, we represent COVID-19 to 3 additional impacts. a rise in inequality, both in terms of household income as well as in food consumptions within a country, a rise in government debt that limits the ability of governments to invest on the long term, for instance, in education and health systems. And we represent school closures that have effects on long-term learning losses. And we use those scenarios to project how COVID-19 might be affecting food security over the long term. What you're seeing on this slide is a graph showing global extreme poverty from 2017 out to 2040 in absolute number of people in billions, from a no COVID scenario and the two COVID-19 scenarios. And there's already a lot of important takeaways and things that we can learn from this graph alone. Basically, what we're seeing is that with and without COVID-19, the world is set to continue to make progress on lowering extreme poverty over time. So basically, after 2025, all the lines are downward sloping. But clearly, there's a persistent effect of COVID-19 on global extreme poverty, not only in 2020, but out to 2040. By 2040, an estimated 103.9 to almost 200 million additional people live in extreme poverty relative to a no COVID scenario. So what COVID-19 is really doing is kind of slowing down the progress that we're making in lowering global extreme poverty over time. And in relative terms, it means that we're losing 6 to 12 years in the fight against ending global extreme poverty. That means that the percentage of the population that lives in extreme poverty in the current PATH scenario in 2040 would have been reached 6 years earlier if COVID-19 had not happened. Now, a second core outcome indicator that we focus on is global undernourishment. And a lot of the insights that we see on extreme poverty are also true for undernourishment. Basically, the world has continued to set to make progress on lowering global undernourishment over time. And after 2025, we basically again see downward sloping lines. But also by 2040, there's a persistent effect of COVID-19 on raising global undernourishment by 46.5 to almost 90 million people relative to a no COVID scenario. Now, often there are basically several kind of projections and scenarios out there today that try to estimate the effects of COVID-19, sometimes on the short run, but there are also some projections that, for instance, go out to 2030. And we often kind of get a question, how do our scenarios compare to some of the other work that is out there? And for instance, when we look at projections from FAO as well as USDA, which have been two other agencies that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on food security by 2030, we see that our scenarios basically are somewhere in the middle of that range. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are correct or either of those scenarios is correct. But what it does mean is that our scenario isn't necessarily extremely pessimistic, nor is it extremely optimistic relative to those other scenarios. Now, going back one slide, we can basically see like the same insight in terms of global extreme poverty, in which there have been projections from the World Bank of around, I believe the most recent projections suggest 97 million additional people in extreme poverty in 2020. And some projections go out to 150 million from IFPRI. And again, we are somewhere in the middle of that range, with projections ranging between 101 and 180 million people in 2020. Now, a third indicator that we looked at is global child stunting. And again, you're seeing here a graph in which the world is set to continue to make progress on lowering global child stunting from 2017 to 2040. And by 2040, we again see a setback because of COVID-19 of around 3.8 to 7.2 million additional children that are stunted in 2040 relative to a no COVID scenario. Now, to put that last number a little bit into context, I believe in 2019, there were around 6.9 million children stunted in Indonesia. So basically COVID-19 is by 2040 almost adding kind of an Indonesia to the world in terms of additional child stunting. Now, extreme poverty and global undernourishment respond very similarly to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're actually seeing a slightly different response in terms of global child stunting. And I would like everyone to kind of focus on the no COVID line and the light blue COVID-19 current path line. What we're seeing is what we were seeing in terms of global extreme poverty was a shock that was basically with a persistent effect over time. What we're seeing in terms of global child stunting is basically a widening between these two lines, which suggests that many of the effects of COVID-19 will actually worsen over time in terms of child stunting. And that very importantly has to do with some of the underlying drivers of child stunting. At the one hand, it is related to caloric intake, and COVID-19 is affecting that and also driving up child stunting on the short term. But other drivers of child stunting are related to access to water and sanitation and maternal education. Now, what we're seeing today, of course, are learning losses, and especially learning losses affecting girls' education. But it takes 5, 10, maybe 15 years for those learning losses to really affect maternal education over time. And because of that, we're seeing some long-term effects of COVID-19 as well on raising child stunting relative to a no-COVID scenario. Now, that has two important implications. It means that we have time. We have time to address some of these potential losses and to minimize the long-term effects on child stunting. But it also means that we have to be very careful when we talk about containing or ending the pandemic. There might be a kind of human health end to the pandemic in which we are able to contain the virus. But there's a real risk that negative effects on economic and human development will continue even after we've been able to contain the COVID-19 virus. Now, so far, we've really focused on global takeaways to give you a little bit of a kind of the big picture. In the report, we look at both global results, world region results, but also we have country results available. What we're really seeing is when we start looking at the different regions is that there's a risk of an unequal recovery, and that COVID-19 is primarily affecting economic and human development in already the most vulnerable regions, as well as the most vulnerable countries. If we, for instance, look at extreme poverty, as well as if we look at child stunting, we see that of the additional children or people that are affected by COVID-19, more than half of them will live in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, another way to think about that unequal recovery is to look at the unequal path scenario relative to the COVID-19 current path. In that unequal path scenario, there are additional negative effects on lower middle income countries. And that scenario currently projects that because of that, in 2040, more people will live in extreme poverty and undernourishment than did in 2019. So to take a little bit of a quick pause before we move on into trying to kind of understand how COVID-19 is affecting food security. What we've seen so far is that with and without COVID-19, the world has continued to make progress on improving indicators of food security and human well-being. What COVID-19 is really doing is persistently slowing down this progress, with the largest effects on extreme poverty, basically resulting in 6 to 12 years lost in trying to end global extreme poverty by 2040. And the effects of COVID-19 predominantly fall to some of the most vulnerable regions and vulnerable countries. Now, so far, we've really focused on the numbers. What we're seeing in our report, as well as in many other reports, is that really the main effect of COVID-19 on food security is through the economic system and through kind of lowering the economic access to food. What you're seeing here is that in 2020, reductions in GDP growth drive down household income. That lowers caloric consumption. But that's not only an effect that occurs in 2020. Relative to a no-COVID scenario, we see persistent lower caloric consumption by 2040 of around 10 to 12% in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. A second core component of how COVID-19 is affecting food security scenarios is through raising inequality. So it's not only reducing the kind of average consumption of calories, but it's especially affecting the consumption of poor to the near poor households, further driving up food security or food insecurity for them. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no other effects of COVID-19 beyond kind of effects to the economic system and household income and food prices. There are some knock-on effects of economic growth on both dietary diversity as well as on food production. There are some ways in which households can cope with some of the losses of income in terms of food consumption. And they can try to maintain some of at least the caloric consumption when income drops. What you see here is basically a shift in dietary diversity, in which households start consuming less meat and start favoring consumption of crops more. That means that at least their calories might be maintained over time. And again, what we're seeing is that in 2020, there's a reduction in meat consumption, but also out to 2040, we're seeing a 2 to 2.5% drop in meat consumption in, for instance, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. Now, what that suggests is that kind of some of the indirect effects of COVID-19, both on the short term as well as on the long term, might be a lowering of dietary diversity. Probably it's not only that households will shift consumption away from meat towards crops, but likely underlying that there will also be shifts from fruits and vegetables to, for instance, staple crops, which further kind of lowers the ambition to provide everyone with a healthy and diverse diet. A different knock-on effect of COVID-19 is on the food production system. What you're seeing here is a world map that shows the food self-sufficiency ratio, which is basically the opposite of food import dependence. And countries in yellow are food import countries by 2040. And in red, it means that they have a negative effect of COVID-19 in becoming kind of more food import dependent over time in 2040 relative to a no COVID scenario. Now, why is that happening? What we're seeing is that reduced economic growth basically results in lower agricultural investments over time. That reduction in agricultural investment especially affects agricultural production and means that there's less progress being made on raising yields as well as raising overall production. And that balance in terms of both lowering agricultural production as well as lowering aggregate demands at the country level means that a certain set of countries become more food import dependent. Some of the countries that stand out here are, for instance, the DRC, Madagascar, and to a lesser extent, India, Mali, and Tanzania. So it's especially the food insecure countries that will basically become more food import dependent over time because of COVID-19. And that further raises their risks for food insecurity and their kind of responses to changes in the global food production system. So far we've looked at how much COVID-19 is affecting the food security and why that is the case. A third section of the report tries to focus on comparing some of the long-term effects of COVID-19 relative to effects of climate change and conflict. And that's, of course, very much kind of an apples to oranges comparison. And it's a very complicated question. And I'm also not going to give you one easy answer today. But one of the ways to think about that question is to think to what pathways or in what ways are COVID-19 affecting food security, or in what ways is climate change affecting food security? As we've argued so far, COVID-19 is primarily affecting food access, and because of that, driving up food insecurity. If we look at climate change, actually a lot of the research and a lot of the literature is focused on food supply and how climate change might be affecting patterns of food production globally. There are also some studies that look at the effects of climate change on food access, but generally speaking, there's much less focus on that pathway relative to the food production pathway. There are also different uncertainties associated with COVID-19 and with climate change. While much is uncertain about how COVID-19 is affecting the world today, as well as how long it might persist and potentially how bad it can still get, climate change is something that is already happening today, but we still don't really know, like, will we be in a 1.5 degrees world or in a 6 degrees world by 2050? So there's real uncertainty about the extent of the impact of climate change over time. And it's not only that, but there's also uncertainties about how changes in the climate will actually be affecting food production. So it's not always that easy to kind of one-on-one translate a change in aggregate global mean temperatures towards effect on food production and food security. So that's one way to kind of qualitatively think about a comparison between COVID-19, climate change, and conflict. Another way is to actually do a quantitative comparison. And there's not always that much data available in terms of effects of climate change on, for instance, poverty on the long term, or effects of climate change on undernourishment. But the effects of climate change on undernourishment at least have been much more studied. What you're seeing here are different studies that quantify the increase in undernourishment between a climate change scenario and a no climate change scenario. And basically every horizontal line is an individual study that has different climate change scenarios as well as different socioeconomic scenarios. And the stars on this graph show you the mean effects within that study of how climate change is affecting undernourishment. Now, one of the important insights I think here is that the uncertainty related to the effect of climate change on undernourishment is huge. And that's not only purely associated with how much the climate itself will change. There are some studies that basically suggest that there's no effect of climate change on undernourishment by 2050, or even a slightly positive effect. Other studies, more to the bottom right, actually show that climate change might be driving up food undernourishment and food insecurity by somewhere between 25 to 35%. So it's really a very kind of large, big range in terms of the potential effects of climate change and food security over time across these different studies. What we can say is that the range of COVID-19 on raising undernourishment in 2040 is somewhere between 6 to 12%. And if we look at a lot of the different climate change studies, they basically cover the same range. They are somewhere between 5 to 15% increases in terms of undernourishment. So at least, and maybe a little bit surprising also for ourselves, what we were showing is that the range of the effects of COVID-19 relative to effects of climate change on undernourishment are negligible. And basically the impacts fall within the same range for a lot of these different studies. Now, that's a lot of information that I've already shared with you today. So I kind of want to start wrapping up the presentation. So what this report tries to answer is, how will COVID-19 be affecting long-term food security? And we show that there's a real risk for kind of long-term persistent effects of COVID-19 on human well-being indicators. Those effects primarily affect the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable regions. And the main ways in which this effect operates is through lowering economic food access. The impacts that we've quantified, and again saying that any comparison isn't easy, at least aren't negligible relative to long-term effects of climate change on food security. Now, no model can predict the future. What models can do and what scenarios can do is help you think about the future. And what we've shown here is that scenarios in which there is an impact of COVID-19 in 2020 out to 2025, and after that, there's not really any policies being taken to kind of revert some of those effects. In those worlds, depending on how bad the effect of COVID-19 gets, there's a real long-term negative persistent effect of COVID-19 on food security. Now, hopefully that's not a world we want, and hopefully that's not a world that we choose for. So this is also kind of thinking about a call to action to try to minimize, revert, and maybe even make additional progress in terms of food security in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, I want to end the presentation and hand it back over to Chris for any Q&A.
Thank you, Willem, and thank you very much for the presentation.